democracy is stronger because we have continued to define ourselves and refuse to be distracted. No individual is there forever, but there is no term limit on values, institutions, or progress.
Now, there is no term limit on progress, but should there be one for presidents? For decades, many African leaders have received criticism from mostly the West on their refusal to step aside after 2 terms. But are these criticisms warranted? Some countries have descended into violence around the issue. Others have seen great success. But limited presidential terms does not necessarily make a country democratic. So, should Africa set its own standards? And what is the way forward in Africa's 3rd term debate? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, Sam Nujoma amended Namibia's constitution in 1999 to allow him a 3rd term as president. Zambia's Frederick Chiluba and Malawi's Bakili Muluzi, however, failed to achieve the same goal. Last year, a referendum cleared the way for Rwanda's Paul Kagame to run for a 3rd term. But that same decision in Burundi has left the country in crisis. Here's a broader view of Africa's 3rd term debate.
To go or not to go? That is a big question as a growing number of African countries change their constitutions to remove presidential term limits. 3rd termism has become the elephant in the room. In December 2015, 98.4% of Rwandans who voted in a national referendum favored a 3rd term for Paul Kagame, who's effectively ruled Rwanda since the 1994 genocide, in which nearly 1 million people were killed. Earlier in October, Congo-Brazzaville voted in a plebiscite to extend Denis Sassou Nguesso's term in office for another 7 years. In May, Burundi's Constitutional Court validated Pierre Nkurunziza's 3rd term bid, a move that plunged the country into conflict and drew harsh criticism from the African Union. But 3rd termism isn't a new thing in Africa. Sam Nujoma amended Namibia's constitution in 1999 to allow him a 3rd term. He finally ceded power in 2004. Zambia's Frederick Chiluba and Malawi's Bakili Muluzi, however, failed in their attempts to change the constitution to extend their terms. In Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré was forced to resign after his plans to extend his 27-year rule were met with an uproar. And shortly after taking power in 1986, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni wrote, "The problem of Africa in general and Uganda in particular is not the people but the leaders who want to overstay in power." Among African heads of state, Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe has perhaps been the most vocal critic of presidential term limits. He's ruled Zimbabwe since 1980. Other long-serving presidents in Africa include Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang and Angola's José Eduardo dos Santos, both having served 35 years respectively. Cameroon's Paul Biya has been at the helm for 34 years. But are presidential term limits a good or a bad thing for Africa? For now, the jury is still out there.
Now, shortly after taking power in 1986, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni wrote, and I quote, "The problem of Africa in general and Uganda in particular is not the people but leaders who want to overstay in power," end quote. But now, 30 years later, President Museveni is eyeing his 5th presidential term. We spoke to Uganda's government spokesperson, Ofuono Opondo, to find out what changed.
In which ways has President Museveni lived up to the principles that made the NRA wage a bush war for many years?
Well, the first point really was defranchisement of Ugandans. And so over the years, NRM has re-established democracy, reintroduced peace in the homes, peace in the country, stability in the region. We had a failed economy, which was on magendo, on smuggling. We have managed to rehabilitate fully. We are now on development, major projects. Much of what Uganda consumes now comes from here, or if it is imported, it is a mutual relationship. Above all, we have been able to maintain the territorial integrity of Uganda and to be respected in the region. in accordance with our Pan-Africanist position, supporting brotherly countries in Africa, in Rwanda, in Congo, South Sudan, Somalia.
Now, shortly after taking over power in 1986, President Museveni said something, and I quote, he said that the problem with African countries in general and Uganda in particular is not the people, but the leaders who overstay in power. What has changed?
Well, not just the leaders who have overstayed in power, leaders who overstay in power without democratic credentials. I think there are people who have deliberately edited out the issue of democracy, because what has changed is that we have restored elections, we have restored freedom of speech, we have restored freedom of movement, we have restored freedom of thought, and we have reintroduced regular, free and fair elections. And even where there are disputes, there are democratic, peaceful, legal means to resolve those disputes. So that's what has changed. Because Museveni is no longer just Museveni the president. He doesn't impose himself. He presents himself among many other candidates. In this particular election, there are other 7 candidates. So when Museveni wins this election, you cannot say he has imposed himself. There are other 7 choices from which Ugandans can choose.
What does President Museveni hope to achieve or to accomplish if he's elected into power again this time around?
Well, Uganda is a country in progress, the theme is steady progress, but it's also a country on continuous building. One of the things that we have done is to build the foundation for macroeconomic social transformation. We believe in the next 5 years we should be able to move Uganda, Museveni should be able to move Uganda from where it is to low middle income or lower middle income country, where about 60% are in formal sector and they are working in gainful employment. We hope by that time we should be able to banish completely illiteracy, particularly the ability to read and write. We should be able to dramatically reduce maternal and infant mortality. We should be able to complete or to put at a better phase, bigger development projects, but especially transportation, energy, especially electricity, because these are the key things that will make Uganda attractive, conducive, and affordable for investment, especially foreign entrepreneurship.
What message does the NRM have to people in Africa who advocate for presidential term limits? People who support presidential term limits?
Every country, every community has peculiarities. In our own case, and Africa in particular, we have had a lot of problems. When you have a chance and you have a good president, I think it is good to hold on to him or to her. Those who say so don't know about Africa. The African countries where there are term limits, but they are not any different from Uganda. Tanzania is one case, Zambia is another, Malawi is another. In terms of per capita, in terms of literacy levels, in terms of infant mortality, in terms of maternal mortality, in terms of GDP growth, in terms of urbanization, they are no better than Uganda. They have term limits. Europe, which does not have term limits, many of them, what is critical is the enlightenment of the leadership. What is it that you are doing for the people? And are people free to remove you or not, democratically and peacefully? So we would advise those to always remember that every country has unique peculiarities.
That was my next question. As you say, every country has unique peculiarities. But you remember President Museveni scrapped the term limits in Uganda?
Well, Museveni didn't scrap. Parliament did scrap. Even if Museveni had wanted to scrap, and members of Parliament didn't agree with him, or indeed, the onus should be on opposition parties, people who challenge him, to go and concentrate their efforts, much of their effort, in ensuring that they elect majority of members of Parliament from opposition parties so that they can hopefully restore a term limit. If that is what is affecting them most, if that's their real affliction, they should go and campaign vigorously for opposition candidates to beat the majority in the next parliament. But as is, we are afraid they are out of time.
Well, we're going to take a short break here on the program, but when we come back, my expert guests will help unpack Africa's third term debate. To stay with us.
What I know is that there are also many other countries where heads of state, when they've finished their mandate, they leave and another person comes. So I think we must really commend those countries and to see that where that happens, there tends to be peace. So why do we want to do things that are going to compromise peace?
Well, that was the African Union Commission Chair, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, giving her views on Africa's third term debate. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to help unpack the issue further, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg. Paul Graham, he's a senior advisor at the Afrobarometer. In Lagos, Dr. Ola Bello, he's the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. And in London, Paul Melly, he's an Associate Fellow of the Africa Program at the Chatham House. To you all, thank you very much for joining in the conversation. Dr. Bello, in Lagos, let me start off with you on this conversation and start off with a comment by President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. He says of third term limits, our democracy is stronger because we have continued to define ourselves and refuse to be distracted. But there is no term limit on values, on institutions, and on progress. Are we taking this third term debate on African presidentials a little bit too far, do you think?
Well, I think it's a healthy debate to have. And when President Kagame talked about the significant socioeconomic progress that the country is recording, very much in the context of a political system that many think is not as open as it should be. I think those who worry about this sort of stance and who come out very clearly against, the spreading cancer, I would call it, of totemism that we're seeing right across many contexts in Africa. I think this is a debate we must have. To my mind, development and security are essential for Africa. Unless we get governance right and make it more inclusive, I think we will not be able to reap the dividends of security in Africa. Neither would we be able to stand up and be counted as one of the developed and, in fact, advancing parts of the world. So it's all well and good for President Kagame to say, oh, thank you, we're doing good here. But what we would like to see in countries like Rwanda and elsewhere on the continent is greater political inclusion. Right. Having one man sitting at the top for so long, I think hardly conduces to that.
I'm going to come to you, Paul Graham, though, in Johannesburg. Are we putting, though, the whole question of democracy and governance, as Dr. Bello has put it there, are we putting that too much at the expense of stability, economic development, and saying, oh, well, we do need to look at this term limit?
Look, the problem that Mr. Kagame will face, as well as others, is that the longer you stick around, the more the systems around you will atrophy, the more policy will become personalized, the more state institutions will weaken. So if he and others are looking to build strong states in which development can be sustained, then they really need to think much harder about spreading leadership and making their whole system open. Sitting there at the top, assuming you're the best person for the job or the best man for the job, ultimately will be unsustainable.
Right. Paul Melly in London, what's your view?
Well, I think one of the most interesting trends is in the West African region as a whole, where almost all countries in the region in ECOWAS are now agreed at government level that there should be a two-term limit. In fact, they actually tried to discuss this and reach region-wide agreement last year, and only Togo and Gambia, where we have long-standing, rather personalized regimes, objected and blocked a possible agreement. And we've got a very striking situation in Senegal now. Last night, President Macky Sall of Senegal called a referendum for the 20th of March, which is where he's going to call on the Senegalese people to endorse a constitutional framework that will set a two-term limit that is irrevocable and that future governments won't be able to change, and which will set the terms at 5 years, except for the 7-year term he is serving at the moment, which he had wanted to reduce, but the Constitutional Council said he had to serve the full 7 years. So you're getting more stability, I think, in the West African region because of the limits.
All right. You're all in agreement that perhaps there needs to be a limit on the presidential terms there. But Dr. Bello, to you first. Limited term limits does not necessarily make a country more democratic. For Africa, though, should Africa now be looking at setting its own standards?
Well, I think what is absolutely essential to emphasize in this debate is that there will never be a one-size-fits-all for all of the different countries in Africa, very diverse political and economic system, multi-ethnic societies, all of them very much striving to find the right balance in terms of the way you frame your constitution. I think that's the first point to emphasize. There is no need to hide away from it. There are countries where there are no explicit time limit, including the United Kingdom, interestingly as it were, where, you know, institutions have developed a pace over many centuries, and the idea that somebody comes to power who simply sits tight and never wants to leave would be rather absurd. In Africa, I think we should be working towards time limit for very clear reasons. As I said, these are multi-ethnic societies. Look back 100 years from where we are now. These states did not exist in the current in the form in which they are currently constituted. So we brought together many nationalities to form a lot of these countries. If you're going to give everyone a fair shot at the top and give them the sense that they are being included, and more importantly, if you're going to have political systems that are dynamic and innovative enough to engage everyone's talent so that we can move these countries forward, you need constant innovation.
Well, Paul Melly, though, in London, we've heard there is no one-size-fits-all, but you've just talked about the situation of West African countries. There is no one-size-fits-all for African countries. So what should Africa do?
Well, I think possibly these trends will develop on a regional basis. So, as I mentioned, there seems to be almost complete consensus in West Africa that a two-term limit is sensible, and because that's a view shared fairly broadly across most political classes in most countries, as well as among people in the wider population, it's possible to move forward with some sort of regional understanding on that. Whereas it may be that in Eastern or in Southern Africa or in the Horn of Africa, we haven't yet reached a stage where there's a broad regional agreement. But I would agree with Professor Bello on this point that if you have a two-term limit, it does stimulate innovation, because you know, among politicians, if you know that the incumbent president is going to have to leave at the end of their current term or the term after that, it sets a time limit. It stimulates people with new ideas and new ambitions to come forward in the political class as potential successors. Whereas when you have a very long-serving president who appears to be determined to stay indefinitely,
Right.
this can produce a sort of stagnation, because people of talent and ability who might have ambitions to lead their country instead may think, oh well, I'll take a job abroad or go and join the UN or the World Bank or something like that. So it can have a stagnating effect, a suffocating effect on the development of political talent if you don't have a term limit.
Right. Paul Graham, your thoughts on that, though? Has it contributed to stagnation of some African countries? Because, of course, as we speak now, that democratic electoral process is more the norm rather than the exception in many African countries.
One of the challenges is that the people who stay around a long time also start to have an influence within the AU and within their regional economic communities out of proportion to their necessary legitimacy. And that does have an impact on the debate across the continent. I should just say two things. The one is we're talking about presidential and semi-presidential systems where term limits are perfectly appropriate and should be encouraged. And then some countries in Africa which have really parliamentary systems. And those are the only countries that you can compare with the parliamentary system in Britain. So it's disingenuous to have an argument that certain countries don't have term limits. They also don't have presidential systems. There's two norms that we think are important. The first is the African Charter on Democracy, Economics and Governance. And that does not specify, it merely deals with democratic principles. The other norm is the views of citizens. And the Afrobarometer makes it very clear that in all the countries in Africa that we survey, citizens do not want their elected leaders to stay on indefinitely.
Dr. Bello, in terms of the views of citizens and in the situation like Rwanda's, where 93% of the population did want President Kagame to continue ruling, don't people really have a choice here when it comes to that?
I think what's fairly clear to me is that, if you can show me one example of an African Lee Kuan Yew or even an African Deng Xiaoping, I will sign off on the idea of third term in office for many of the sitting African presidents. The truth of the matter is that the continent, for factors related to our history, but also the reality of the multi-ethnic composition of our state, have not been able to form a political coalition that would help them to take forward the project of state building and developing economies and creating jobs and improving the lot of their people in the way Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore, for example. Until we find our own Lee Kuan Yew or Deng Xiaoping, I think the idea of a third term in power, or even indeed fourth, fifth term for an African president, is a rather absurd one. There is no evidence to really stand this up.
Right. Paul Melly, to you though, has it had a positive or a negative impact though on Africa's governance or on Africa in general?
It's interesting that when you look at the countries where presidents have stayed in power for a very long time, they tend, you can't say always, but very often these tend also to be countries where there are limits on people's freedom, where the media is under pressure sometimes from the government, where people lose, as it were, lose the confidence in the sense that they could make choices to change or alter the direction of the country, so that referendum results that appear to confirm people wanting to stay in power for a very long time can sometimes just really reflect the fact that the public are, as it were, intimidated. They don't believe that anything can change. They're resigned to the fact that they don't really have any political choice. And I think where you get term limits, people gradually get used to the idea that they do have a real choice, and that every so often they can actually completely change the government. They can change not just the party, but the actual person at the top. And of course, what comes with a president, even in the most democratic of societies, is patronage and influence and a circle of associates and a circle of connections and networks, if you like. And it's very good always to refresh that every few years. Whereas when people feel they have no choice, when someone's in power for a very long time, that just becomes the establishment. People have to live with it. It doesn't necessarily mean they're content with it.
Very briefly to you all, and I'll start with Paul Graham. Very briefly, what do you think works best for Africa, and what could work best for Africa?
Legitimately elected leaders in forms of inclusive government in which the various interests of all people are attended to. That means stronger parliaments, better judicial institutions, and presidents who come and go, leaving the space open for people to feel that they can energize their society and take responsibility themselves for its future.
Right. Paul Melly in London?
I would agree with that. I think building up stronger institutions more generally, and again, we are seeing a start of this. For example, in Mali, now the leader of the opposition has been given official status, and in the new reform package being proposed in Senegal, both the parliament and the leader of the opposition will be given increased power, so that will strengthen their capacity to hold the government to account, because it's asking questions and opening up debate that helps to keep a government on its toes.
Dr. Bello, you have the final word. What would work best for Africa?
I think it's healthy that we're having this debate, and I think Africa today is a much different place than it was 20 years ago. Broadly, I'm positive that citizens are convinced that if they take their own fate into their own hands, they do have the power to change things and help to move Africa forward in a much more positive direction. From Congo-Kinshasa to Burundi, to Rwanda, to Congo-Brazzaville and elsewhere, where we've seen this ugly phenomenon of separatism re-emerging. I'm convinced that people power would prevail again, and Africa would go well.
Gentlemen, thank you for all your insights. And that's all we have time for this week. Thank you to my guests. In Johannesburg, Paul Graham, he's a senior advisor at Afrobarometer. In Lagos, Dr. Ola Bello, he's the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. And in London, Paul Melly, he's an Associate Fellow of the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.